Hey, welcome everyone. Simon Rosenberg back with another great event today for you. We are joined by another one of our intrepid and hardworking attorneys general here in the United States, Attorney General Andrea Campbell from Massachusetts. Welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Listen, we are now, I think we've had 6 or 7 of your colleagues on here at Hopium over the last few months. And we've really held up the attorneys general as exemplars in this fight to preserve our constitutional order. And all of you have a special role, actually. I mean, in the division of labor in our federalized country, and where states are sovereign governing entities, just like the federal government is, turns out that attorneys general have a disproportionately critical role in a time of a constitutional crisis. And so I'm wondering if you could just reflect a little bit about the battle, the work you've been doing with your fellow attorneys general across the country, and some of the fights that are specific to Massachusetts that you've been really proud of and some of the successes you've had.
Thank you for having me and some of my colleagues. And I appreciate your frame at the outset, because it really is AGs that are on the front lines, and sadly only Democratic AGs, and not for lack of trying. We engage with our Republican AGs on other issues, but they're nowhere to be found on federal accountability work or holding the Trump administration accountable. And so we are coordinated. We communicate regularly. Us Democratic AGs have put aside our egos to really say we have significant work to do to protect the rule of law, our democracy, democratic values, our respective states, our residents, and our economies. And so we're mobilizing. I'll give you one example that I was just talking to another group of stakeholders about, and it's in the context of public education. Now that most of our kids are back in school, in Massachusetts, many start in August. This was a big victory for Democratic AGs. You're talking about billions of dollars that the federal government gives to our states for public education. Most municipalities, most school districts across the country get those funds in July. And because of the Trump administration, you don't know what's going to come. A few days before July 1, maybe even for some, a day before, they sent a 3-sentence email to school districts saying, we're not giving you that money unless we know that you're going to align, in quotes, with the president's priorities. And no one knew what those were. So we immediately mobilized and filed a lawsuit. And frankly, didn't have to do much after that, because we mobilized along with educators and families and got them to turn on those billions of dollars, of which over 100 million come to Massachusetts for public education. And this is for curriculum development, our educators, mental health supports, you name it, critical funding for the public education infrastructure in this country. And I don't think we have to explain why this is important. And that's just one of our victories. And we're now up to close to 35 lawsuits on other issues, including biomedical research and NIH funding and so much more. And we're mobilized and we're ready to go, and we're operating with a sense of fearlessness and urgency, because we know what's at stake, but also because we love this country deeply.
How would you, you've had all these wins, and I think that people don't really know sometimes when a lawsuit is won, who's behind it, right? I mean, I think that, oftentimes, like, for example, you've been very successful in fighting Trump's clearly unconstitutional and illegal tariffs. Has been one of the fights that you all have waged. That's something important to us, that we've been really cheering that on, and thank you for that important work. But can you reflect, just take a step back for a second and think about your law school training and, the path that you chose to go down as in your own career, and that you're in this fight right now for the rule of law and our constitutional order in a way that is an unprecedented threat, really, in the history of the United States. And that this is what you're now fighting, instead of doing all the things you thought you were going to do as Attorney General, right? Which is fighting for consumers and, making sure that criminals get prosecuted. We're now fighting to preserve our democracy in an unprecedented way. And how does that, when you get up in the morning and you go to work, how does that make you feel? I mean, what's your response to all that?
It's a great question, and we probably could take 40 minutes to talk about it. First of all, it's an honor and privilege to be the Attorney General of Massachusetts, first Black woman to even serve in this role, and I never take that for granted, because in reflecting on one of our fights, dealing with birthright citizenship and protecting the 14th Amendment, And yes, we're fighting back in a litigation and posture against the administration to protect the 14th Amendment, not just because they're targeting unborn babies or babies as a part of their immigration policy and to dismantle birthright citizenship. But if you know the history of the 14th Amendment, I can't become Attorney General of Massachusetts without the 14th Amendment, or vote without the 14th Amendment, when this country decided over 150 years ago, and we learned that in law school and maybe before that, that people fought as a collective to figure out post-slavery and those being enslaved, what we're going to do with those Black folks. Well, we're going to give them citizenship and all the rights and privileges that attach. And so we are standing up in this moment in time, and I'm doing with a deep sense of urgency because I do know what's at stake. And I do wish I didn't have to go and file lawsuits over and over again with respect to birthright citizenship, or of course to protect our other institutional systems, our public health funding, our public education funding, our libraries, funding for our libraries and cultural institutions, even to protect biomedical research and clinical trials for kids for pediatric cancer. It's at moments heart-wrenching, because we should be instead focusing on the issue of affordability and the cost of living crisis that folks in this country are facing every single day. So we are doing our part in balancing this federal accountability work with the sense of urgency that it deserves, but not taking our sights off these other issues that are equally important. Yeah. Consumer protection cases. We just had a huge tenant housing case for $10 million that we settled to protect tenants in some of the most egregious housing conditions. We just put out our junk fee regulations for all those hidden and pesky costs. So we are continuing to push the envelope on consumer issues and affordability issues. But at the end of the day, we certainly wish we had a federal partner in that work. And instead, they're focused on harming kids, harming folks who are immigrants, putting out false narratives about immigrants, undermining our democracy, trying to dismantle our Constitution. And none of us prepared for that in law school. But it is what it is. So we'll just keep fighting the fight, Simon.
How do you think about how can you talk to us about the Supreme Court this year? And it's not just the sense that they seem to be almost always ruling in Trump's favor, but also them accelerating cases that are important to the president to help him out, to look like they're helping him out. This increased use of the shadow docket, where there's now no decisions are being made, where down, for the lower courts and for folks like you, there's no actual understanding of why the decision was made. So it creates more confusion in the law. How can you talk to us about where you're sitting and what you've seen with the Supreme Court and how you're thinking about and how it's affecting the work that you're doing?
I think a few months ago, I would have said I still had hope in the Supreme Court and the thoughtfulness from the justices. But as we get more and more decisions, particularly in this shadow docket that you mentioned, with no transparency, no explanation to not just us as lawyers or those in the system fighting back or those in our courts, but even to the lay person. Every one of us we have an expectation, and rightfully so, that we will know what government is doing, including a Supreme Court, on our behalf, and what is informing their decisions. And so I am becoming more and more disappointed in what we're seeing out of the Supreme Court. Not every justice, many are standing up, and I appreciate Justice Sotomayor. We both went to Princeton, and maybe it's the Princeton in us, her getting out there and being very forward on some of her dissents or even other engagements about what is at stake here, or Justice Jackson the same, and pushing for greater transparency and from their colleagues. And so I don't know that we're going to get that anytime soon. That transparency or lack thereof, I think, will continue. I think the politicization of our court, the lack of objectivity in some instances, overturning decades of precedent. You learn in law school that that's where you start. Well, what's the question and what are you trying to solve? Well, you look at precedent. You go back to the cases that came before, and you analyze them in a thoughtful way. And we're not seeing that necessarily, or we're seeing precedent being turned on its head for reasons that seem to be political in terms of the outcome they want to reach, while putting to the side the law itself. That's dangerous, especially when you think about how it undermines the credibility of our highest court. It undermines, from some people's perspective, the integrity of that court. It undermines this significant branch of government and how it was designed, which was to be a check on the executive. It undermines that. So we are in dangerous territory for sure. That being said, not all hope is lost. I do think we continue to navigate our courts within our respective states, our appeals court. We just had a huge victory yesterday in our FEMA brick case. For infrastructure projects for climate resiliency, for example, where they wanted to cut the funding for that. That was a Republican appointed judge who I think probably is also very concerned about not only what he saw in that particular case, but other parts of outside of other concerns around the power of Congress being undermined in the context of this executive. So I'm keeping hope alive. And at the end of the day, reminding folks, this is why it's important to vote and be civically engaged. And I say that in a loving way. The justices didn't get there by themselves. Folks in Congress don't get there by themselves. The president didn't get there by themselves. If you want different outcomes, different policy decisions, you have to mobilize to vote. And frankly, if you need another reminder as to how to do it in more dark times, then reflect on those folks who fought during a period of slavery in this country for the 14th Amendment and its passage. And they would probably never, in many ways, see the benefits of the 14th Amendment, but they still showed up. And I think the civic engagement conversation is just as important as our litigation efforts.
Well, in speaking of civic engagement, and I was on the board of the Tisch School at Tufts for many years. I'm a Tufts grad, and so I spent 4 years in Massachusetts as a young guy. We started a project this summer called the Resolutions Project, which has now spread to 22 states, including Massachusetts, 81 jurisdictions, where local city councils and counties are passing resolutions similar to what the founding fathers did and how they built support for the independence movement back in the 1760s and the 1770s. We actually learned from some of their tactics. And these are creating the equivalent of what happened in the Declaration of Independence, a series of whereas statements about the condemnation of Donald Trump for abandoning the constitutional order. And I just want to report to you that the leading state so far is arguably Massachusetts. We've now passed resolutions in Boston, East Hampton, and Amherst. We have more that are being introduced and planned. And so some of your fellow Commonwealthers in Massachusetts are doing their part to make sure to protest this incredible attack on our constitutional order. And we'll make sure that you and your team get briefed up on some of your fellow Massachusetts residents who are doing their part in this important moment.
And I'm grateful for your leadership and, of course, the leadership of folks throughout the Commonwealth. And I tell folks, it's not going to be one person that gets us to the other side of this administration and to more light versus more dark. It is going to be individual efforts, and at the local level, critically important. So thank you for lifting up those municipalities. And frankly, it just speaks to the history of Massachusetts. We have always been in the fight from the very beginning, and that can never be discounted. So it's a history I reflect on frequently when needing to infuse more courage and more hope within myself.
Well, listen, any final words for anybody, any advice? You've already given us some great advice today, but anything you want to share with folks before we go?
I think it's this idea of a collective effort. I've been hearing from a lot of folks, particularly at the organizational level, nonprofits, who are doing a lot of work, say with young people, for example, or doing a lot of work on a mutual aid to protect those folks who are being targeted unlawfully by ICE. Just a lot of significant work happening on the ground. And some would suggest they're not doing enough. And I really push back on that narrative to say any individual who wakes up in these very trying times, goes into work to do their part, is doing enough. I often get the gratitude. I give it right back to everyone. You hosting these conversations and acknowledging the role of Democratic AGs and AGs in this moment is doing enough. And you're doing clearly more than that. So all of us are doing our part. And for those who aren't, find something to attach yourself to in this moment in time to participate, because the collective effort is what's going to win the day against an administration that is, of course, moving away from a democratic institutions, democratic values, to something of fascism, or what we saw in Nazi Germany, but we all can do our part.
One of the ways that we describe what you're talking about is that, we are just part of millions and millions of people who are going to work as proud patriots who are fighting for their
That's
country.
right.
And we all just have to do what we can every day, and to feel that sense of common bond and common purpose with people. And what I talk about at Hopium is that we have to think of ourselves not only with millions of Americans today, but we're standing right by us are people like FDR and Abraham Lincoln and
That's exactly
Martin
right.
Luther King and Barack Obama. Pick your list, whoever the inspiring leaders are that have been there. I often imagine them standing, literally sitting in this room with me here, and being part of this conversation. And I think we're not alone. There are millions of us going to work, and we're also joined by these incredibly powerful leaders throughout American history who've been fighting
That's
for
exactly
freedom
right.
and democracy for hundreds of years. And so thank you for what you've done. I mean, people, I will tell you that our friends in Massachusetts love you. You're an
Oh,
incredibly
thank you.
you're an incredibly
I love
popular
my people
figure.
in
Yeah,
Massachusetts.
I know. You've got a big passionate fan club, I've learned. So it's been great to have you on, and I'm sure they're going to be thrilled when we release this tomorrow.
Well, thank you so much. Keep taking care of yourself, you and your team, and I'll see you soon enough.
Thank you. Good luck with everything.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you, everybody. Another great conversation. I wish I could do more to help explain to all of you the importance of the role the attorneys general have played. I mean, they have shown us that we can win, that we can beat them back. That also, though, I think their most important thing they've done is by them working together every day, 23 of them, they've shown that Democrats can organize at a higher level to fight Trump, because what he wants is us to be separated. He wants us to be alone. He wants to isolate us. And part of the way we're going to get to the other side of this is by coming together and by organizing ourselves into an actual national movement of opposition. We're not there yet, but we're making great strides. And the attorneys general have been incredibly important inspirations to us for what we need to do if we're going to get to the other side of this. Thanks, everybody. Keep fighting. See you soon.